welcome to Midpoint. I'm Sean Canan. I'm the host of Midpoint Monday, and today we're going to look at two topics. First up, a documentary on the wastewater dumping problem in St. Petersburg. It's called St. Pete Unfiltered. We'll speak with a filmmaker in a few minutes, and later on in the show we'll hear from the one attorney of Noor Salman. She's the widow of the Pulse nightclub shooter, and on Friday she was found not guilty of helping in that attack. And we'll take your calls. The number to call in, 813-239-9663. You can email DJ at WMNF.org or text 813-433-0885. That's the number to call in. And first call is the first person to get to be able to ask a question of the filmmakers of St. Pete Unfiltered. I want to turn now to some two comments left by listeners after our last show. Our guest was Amy Weintraub. She's the Reproductive Justice Director with Progress Florida. And she was talking about abortion access in Florida and across the country. So here are two listener comments from last show.
I was just listening to the show on abortion, and I just wanted to say right up front, check out Nancy Jo Mann of the famous heavy metal band Barnabas. Just check her out on the issue of abortion. Anyway, I wanted to get right to the point that I am a fundamentalist Christian, a progressive democratic socialist. I don't like neoconservatism, and I don't like neo-evangelicals, and that's a whole other story. Is abortion morally right? Absolutely not. However, it is neoconservative Republican Party
so this tape lasts a couple minutes. My cursor is over the time, so I can't see exactly. It's around 2 more minutes.
Guaranteed
And
$17 an hour
then we'll start.
Free college tuition of their choice, and maternal leave while they're pregnant in the first year of their child's life. I would say 99.9% of women would not have an abortion. Now, neoconservative policies push women into this, lower-income women, to have an abortion. And this is how the abortion industry would go away. And I did want to make a comment on the woman that's on your show today. She sounds like the Joseph Goebbels of abortion. She is a fanatic. Talk about a zealot. This woman sounds like she'd almost encourage any woman to go out and get pregnant so she can have an abortion just to have one. And let me say this. Every woman that I've ever run into in my life or discussed abortions with regrets it. Any woman that's ever had an abortion. And if they say that they don't, they're lying to you. Lying to you. It is an unnatural act. However, I understand that it is legal, and I understand fully why women do abort their babies. Because it's going to ruin their
that
life.
blinking green light is people calling in, so we're already getting people fired up about this.
With a man that they're not married to.
Bear with it if people react to the caller. It's very provocative, but we'll definitely have plenty of time to talk about this.
Who did not want any children.
It's a female caller, so I wouldn't be surprised if...
I
think the Goebbels.
And of course, we had an abortion, and we were probably abused and neglected because we were not wanted. And a lot of children will suffer because the mother wants an abortion and they can't get it. They feel guilty, like it's a mortal sin. And something should be done about this, and these fake clinics, they should be closed down.
10 seconds.
And we need more abortion clinics.
Yep,
and I wish I was rich, I'd open them up myself. But I know from personal experience what happened to me. Thank you. Goodbye.
Well, those are two listeners commenting about our last show from some different opinions that we're getting from different listeners. So we like the diversity of opinions that we have on the radio here. So we're hoping to get some opinions from you as well. Later on in the broadcast, I'll give out the number for you to leave a voicemail about this show, and you can always listen to previous shows and comment on the stories. That's on our website, WMNF.org/news. You can join us on Twitter or Facebook at WMNF News, Instagram as well. So first up on the show today, we're going to hear about a new documentary that looks at a series of massive dumps of sewage, partially treated sewage, and stormwater into Clam Bayou, Tampa Bay, and other waterways and some land areas. The film is called St. Pete Unfiltered, and joining me in the studio is the film's producer and writer, Brandon Schuler. Welcome to WMS Midpoint, Brandon.
Hey, Sean. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
And am I pronouncing your names correctly?
You are.
All right, great. Well, why don't we start with the scope of the problem that has been going on over the last few years. How much sewage, partially treated sewage, and stormwater was dumped into the environment over a stretch of of how many months or years?
So with St. Pete's antiquated kind of sewage infrastructure and treatment system, this has kind of been an ongoing problem. But it was really exacerbated when they closed Albert Whitted in 2015. When they did that, they effectively reduced the city's treatment capacity by about 25%. And with more storms coming, more wet weather events coming, and not having kind of a contingency plan down the road, the city kind of set themselves up for some bad exposure to sewage dumps, and that's exactly what happened. Ended up with Hermine and a couple of other storms dumping a little over 200,000 gallons of
200 million, right?
Yes, 200 million. I'm sorry, I said 1,000, didn't I? 200 million gallons of raw sewage into Tampa Bay, Glen Bio, and places like that. And then partially treated, and depending on who you talk to, what partially treated is, it can be as much as just taking a piece of paper out of sewage or treating it almost to drinking levels. You know, you're going to get the gamut of who you speak to that was. But that's 800 million. So basically, in a year and a half span, 18 months, we were looking at 1 billion gallons. And since that time, though the city has said we're back up to about 108% capacity with the things that we've done, we're still seeing rain events. And we saw one even during Irma that we had a pretty big dump as well right after that, and spill. You know, the definition between dump and spill depends necessarily on who you're speaking with at the time.
And part of the reason for this problem is that when there is a rain event, the normal amount of wastewater that gets treated by the sewage plants is mixed with all this rainwater. And we can talk, I don't know if you have any very much expertise on this, but about if there's alternatives to that, if there are some cities or communities that do it differently, that keep it completely separate, so that when you do have these rain events, you can still treat the sewage and you deal with the rainwater differently. Is that the case? And before you answer, I think I was seeing a project where there's this gigantic infrastructure project in Chicago where they're trying to do something like that.
They are trying to do that in Chicago. Basically what they've done is they've built underwater reservoirs. And it's interesting, I'm working on a book right now on the Tongass National Forest, and my co-writer with that book lives in Chicago. And he had seen our film and he started talking about that. And the problems that they're starting to realize with that is that it rains, it's a basin. And eventually it just fills up, and then there's nowhere else for the water to go. So you delay the spills and the issues, right? And then you have really St. Pete's solution, what they're doing with deep water injection wells, that they will partially treat this and shoot the water down through injection wells into the Florida aquifer down below us. And the city's contention on this is that aquifer, you know, we don't get our drinking water from there, but you know, if you look at Stevens and the whole idea of the significant nexus with the Clean Water Act, all waters are connected, right? And as you inject more water into the aquifer, you know, the city's contention is that there's saltwater intrusion, so this aquifer's shot. But then if you kind of play the devil's advocate and look at the other direction of that, if there's saltwater intrusion and you keep injecting water into essentially a limestone sponge, where's that water going to go? It's going to go right back out into the bays and into the surface waters, where we get 64% of Tampa Bay's drinking water is from local surface waters.
And you mentioned something that what you're describing is, as you said, it's called deep water injection and wells. And these are things that in a previous show, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about a plan in Florida where there's a bill that's, I believe, still on Governor Rick Scott's desk. He hasn't decided to sign it or veto it, or at least he hasn't announced publicly what he's going to do, as far as I know yet. Where they call it toilet to tap, where they take this partially treated wastewater or mostly treated wastewater, and instead of using it like we do in reclaimed water to water our lawns with it, they use these deep water injection wells and they inject it back down essentially into the aquifer, which is our drinking water supply. And I have to say, when I did that show and people commented about it, there was a lot of opposition to that. But that's one of the very things that St. Pete is doing right now with building these brand new injection wells down near Eckerd College. And as you said, they think the aquifer that they're injecting into is not necessarily drinking water; it's salty water. So they're saying that that's not going to be the immediate problem. But you were alluding to this at the end of your last answer, so maybe you can expound on this. Where does that water go? Even if it's salt water, even if it's not going to be used immediately as drinking water, yet if you put this dirty, partially treated or untreated sewage or wastewater or stormwater runoff, whatever it is, if it goes down into the aquifer, even if it's salty, where might it go from there?
Okay, so 3 points there. I believe that the bill that you're talking about with Governor Scott has been signed. I believe it has. So first point, would like to have another. I wish my executive producer was here, Carolyn Smith. Unfortunately, she had a child emergency this morning. She is more on the legislative side of that. But I believe that went through not last week, but the previous week before that. The second question is that he's injecting these. Where does this water go? Essentially, it goes back down into the aquifer. I mean, you're recharging the aquifer with partially treated water that, you know, you basically have two directions that you can go here with treatment facilities. You can do what Clearwater's done, and the whistleblower, Craven Askew, who is a champion in this against the city of St. Pete, really kind of embraces the idea of the Clearwater model, because they actually take their partially treated water one more treatment step that actually makes toilet to tap possible, which is good because, as you know, we don't have to depend on aquifers. We don't have to deplete our aquifers by providing more drinking water. But then the other option that you have is to move down to these injection wells, and once you move to the injection wells, that's the million-dollar question, is where does the water go? You know, the hope is we can all be optimistic and say, well, it'll stay down in the aquifer and we'll never see it together. But the problem that we have is the Ninth Circuit Court on the West Coast, in a lawsuit with Surfrider National and the state of Hawaii and Maui in particular, have found that injection wells, that there is accretion of that water out from the aquifers back into the drinking well systems. So they're looking at issues that they are starting to see, the human waste that they're injecting into the aquifers actually make their way back into the drinking water chain, which is problematic. And we can all hope, because we need to have solutions here, right? We've got millions of people that live here that, I forgot what the numbers were, so I won't even try to make believe, but it's huge amounts of gallons per individual of raw sewage created a day that we have to find somewhere to put it. And is injection wells the right way to do it? I'd much rather err on the side of caution and say absolutely not.
Our guest is Brandon Schuler. He's producer and writer of the new film, the new documentary, St. Pete Unfiltered. You know, so many directions we could go into right now, but let's talk about what gave you the idea, or gave your team the idea to make this film. How did that happen?
So this started in an environmental law class with quite a few students, and I had a teachable moment. We were coming up to I was coming up to the point in the class that, okay, here's your group projects. Typically break it down in 5 groups. You have to do 5 papers. Unfortunately, school was canceled that day because we had a little storm come along called Irma. So everybody was leaving, and I think we ended up missing like 4 or 5 days from the storm, and just everybody being gone. So when they came back, the first noises of that there were spills again were happening, and it was kind of shocking that it was only like 1 or 2 students in the class that even knew we were having sewage issues. And one of the students said, well, hey, we're doing the Clean Water Act. Can we look at possibly doing like a short documentary? Because they've seen some of the documentary work I've done as my own. I've been a journalist and filmmaker and writer for over 20 years. The filmmaking part's new, but they're familiar with my work, and they were like, can we do a documentary? You know, as a professor, you're thinking, okay, what am I going to get here? And I was like, all right, give me a 90-second clip, do your research, let's see what we can do. Well, they're like, well, we have it. Can we do it at your house because we need like a screen and all this to air it? So I was like, yeah, sure. The symphonic music comes out of like the surround sound, and then all of a sudden this beautiful drone shot climbing up over Tampa Bay showing the St. Pete timeline. And then basically had about 9 or 10 students in the class that I started asking questions. Well, what about this? What about this? And I mean, there was obviously some pretty deep research going. So it's kind of a teachable moment in the sense that all politics are local. All environmental issues start local and need to go out from there. And the impetus of that was, you guys have a final project, you'll have to provide X, Y, and Z, and I want to see a 3-minute YouTube video at the end. And then when we got there, 9 students just basically said, hey, what can we do to turn this into a feature length? And we're still considered a short documentary at 35 minutes. But we have goals with this. I mean, we've got some future airings coming, and we also have funding opportunities to turn this into a national feature. So that's really kind of the impetus behind the project.
How do the sewage spills in your researchers, how do they find that it affects the environment and also human health?
Well, so human health is the obvious. I mean, we have Valerie Harwood from USF, a microbiologist specialist, and then we also had Del Griffin in the film from the USGS, who is a public and health microbiologist. A lot of words there. I might have them wrong. But the human health with E. coli that's released into the water, the other pathogens that are released in the water, have direct impacts on you. And we've actually had 2 folks from the community already reach out to us who have been out at Lacing Park that have actually gotten Vibrio and have been able to tie it back. Vibrio, if you know, Vibrio exists in a bunch of different guises, and I'm no MD by chance, but you have the spectrum from where you can just get like swimmer's rash, where you get the little pimples around a cut, or you can actually get to the point that you have flesh-eating Vibrio that like wipes your legs out and kills you. Those are kind of the threats, and the students kind of notice it. Where they go to school is right on the water, and when there were dumps, there are mornings that you walk on downtown St. Pete's waterway that smells like poop. There's no other way to put it. I mean, you can smell the raw sewage in the air, and it takes a little while for them to get the lime and the fun stuff out there to get rid of the smell. So.
Our guest is Brandon Schuler. He's producer and writer of the new documentary St. Pete Unfiltered, and we'd like to hear from you. If you have a comment or a question about the film or about the St. Pete sewage issue, give us a call. The number to call in is 813-239-9663. You can email dj@wmnf.org. You can text 813-433-0885. You're listening to 88.5 FM WMNF Tampa. My name is Sean Canan. I'm the host of Midpoint Monday. Brandon, so let's go back several years. You mentioned earlier that when the decision to close Albert Whitted happened when Bill Foster was mayor in 2011. What brought about that decision to close the Albert Whitted wastewater treatment plant that's near downtown?
So we don't go that much. We don't go that far back in the film. I mean, we actually use our turning point and start point as the closure of Albert Whitted. So they had decided to close that to create a little bit more fun, beautiful waterfront space. So they opened that and they looked there to do this, and that kind of started the report systems of what would happen if we closed this. And where we really get problematic, and Steve Cornell, city council member, who has been a complete champion on this, kind of looked at the issues and kind of turned out that there was a Brown and Caldwell report that would look at what would happen if the city closed Albert Whitted. And for some reason, unknown to anyone, that Brown and Caldwell report was actually kept off of city. And I actually have seen the film so many times. I think I'm actually using Steve's words exactly, so I apologize for this. But for some reason, staff kept this away from city council and didn't show them what was going on. And the first time around, they voted with no knowledge of what was in the Brown and Caldwell report. The second time they came around, Steve actually changed his vote, and another council member changed their vote because the Brown and Caldwell just basically said, if you close Albert Whitted, you're going to have spills. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about this. And for some reason, that was just kept off of everybody's radar. You know, and some of the criticisms we've had in this film from other folks is that, you know, this is an indictment of the Kreisman administration. This is a political hit of others in the city council. To myself and my team, we're all sympathetic with the current administration. They inherited a bad hand, but it's how they've dealt that hand and how they've played it that has just been mind-numbing. You know, basically trying to cover up. You know, Mike Deason comes out and just basically finds them literally pumping stuff into Clam Bible. And then they're sitting there saying, no, we're not doing it. No, we're not doing it. Oh, what's that over there? Well, that's a raw sewage truck dumping raw sewage. So, you know, our government is predicated by citizens, made by citizens to do the best things for the community. And from our findings in our film, I don't feel like we can say this administration has done the best thing for its citizens. And it has been more along the lines of self-preservation rather than, okay, we've got to bite the bullet and do the right thing and move forward.
One of the other reasons why in 2011 they voted to close Albert Whitted, admittedly without the knowledge that was in this report necessarily, is that the costs to repair it, the capacity was decreased and the cost to repair it or replace it would be more than they thought was worth it. It wasn't just to beautify that area.
Right.
Of course.
Well, they were arguing that they could save $30 million, and that $30 million savings is now costing us $326 million over the next 5 years. And also, that's not even counting, which is mind-boggling, if this week's City Council meeting on Thursday, City Council is actually going to come back and ask for approval up to $500,000 to actually fight against the lawsuit that's pending right now that would have the fixes to the sewage issue overseen by the federal courts instead of just the city and FDEP looking at its consent order. It actually moved into a consent decree, which has a little bit more bite to it.
So the consent order is not necessarily as legally binding as it would be if the courts got involved. And so, what's your opinion? What do you think the city should do in this case?
So, Congresswoman Rice, it was kind of Councilwoman. What did I say? Congress. I'm sorry. I usually do the congressional level, but Councilwoman Rice on the film just basically came out, and I mean I agree with her. She essentially states that she doesn't want to see the city go from consent order to consent order, because essentially they're FDEP in the year that this consent order was ordered had 251 other consent orders delivered to it. It can't enforce 251, and especially one of this magnitude. And she simply states in the film that she would like to see the city just not go from consent order to consent order to actually see this problem fixed. The only way we can necessarily really ensure that this gets fixed, stop fighting it, enter the consent decree, and do the right thing for the citizens of St. Pete.
Our guest is producer and writer Brandon Schuler, who has made the film St. Pete Unfiltered with help from his students. And the number to call in is 813-239-9663. Email dj@wmnf.org or text 813-433-0885. We still have a couple minutes left in this segment. And we're going to go to Joe in Gulfport. Hi, Joe. You're on the phone, and you're in Gulfport, one of the cities that was really affected by the sewage spills.
Yeah, if you can expound on the question.
Go ahead. If not, make it real brief and short. Is anyone still pursuing Raytheon over what they've done to the aquifer? Do you know?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of that.
Yeah, I have the question. So the Raytheon spilled some, and this is more in like west central St. Petersburg, rather than right. That's where that is. And it was a spill on the Raytheon property, and I have to admit I haven't looked into that in a couple of years, and so I don't know where that stands right now, Joe. I'm sorry. Yeah, thanks for doing that. All right, appreciate that, Joe. 813-239-9663 or dj@wmnf.org. If you were affected by the wastewater dumps by St. Petersburg, I'd like to hear from you. Give us a call, 813-239-9663. So the film premiered at the Gasparilla International Film Festival last month. How did you come up with the funding for this film?
That's a tricky question. No funding. We have done this out of pocket completely, all the funding. A lot out of the executive producer's pockets. Students have pitched in where they could. A lot out of my pocket. We did have an anonymous donor that donated the billboard that built quite a bit of stuff. But other than that, I mean, we're looking at. We did this film. We were lucky enough to win the Gasparilla's Audience Choice Florida production. Did this all out of pocket and to ourselves just to get the message out there, and we've done that with no financial support or very little financial support from family and friends. That's it.
Well, thanks so much for joining me on WMS Midpoint, Brandon.
Sean, I appreciate it.
Brandon Schuler is the writer and producer of St. Pete Unfiltered. You can find out more at the website what's the website?
stpeteunfiltered.com is our website, but you can also follow us on Facebook at St. Pete Unfiltered, and everything will be there.
Great. All right. Thanks. I appreciate your time. You're listening to WMNF Tampa, 88.5 FM, WMNF.org.